One.
Welcome to the Triage Method podcast. This is the Monday episode where we discuss some concepts with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell. So, Patrick, what is our meta topic this week? What are we discussing?
Well, today we're talking about periodization because this is a topic that obviously we touched on before and we've gone in depth on before, both on our website and on the podcast. However, we did get a few questions in relating to this in a few different forms, social media, in our questionnaire or our question submission form, which all kind of showed that this is not, or rather we've done a poor job of explaining this topic, or whatever else people are being exposed to is confusing them, right? So we want to kind of set the record straight with this in terms of what does it actually mean for you as an individual, right? So I don't want this to be some big scientific treaty on fucking periodization and what that means. Like that's not what I want. What I want this to be is actionable advice. So at the end of this podcast, you should understand what periodization means as a general concept, but you should also understand what periodization means to you depending on who you actually are. Whether you're someone that's looking for generalized health and fitness, or you are an athlete yourself, right? So you should understand all of that by the end of the podcast. So if you don't understand that, we haven't done our job correctly, right? And you can throw tomatoes at Gary in public if you see him, all right? So that's where we're at. That's the goal of this episode. Discuss even periodization and then how to make that work for you, right? So Gary, the first question I have with this is periodization important? And then why is it important? Like, is it even important?
Yeah, so I guess first of all, sort of like definition of terms is important. So when people talk about periodization, generally they're talking about the structure that a training plan follows over time. So, that there's some sort of logical planned sequence to the training weeks or training months or training years that are carried out. For example, if you were an Olympic athlete, you'd be concerned with periodization over the course of 4 years between Olympic competitions. If you were a powerlifting athlete who competes every 3 to 6 months, you're concerned about how, you periodize your training within that period of time. Okay, so it's basically the structure the training follows over time at a kind of a meta level. So how are training variables changing over time? In terms of the mistakes people make here, they very often confuse programming and periodization. Okay, so programming is more so like the fine details of your program. What exercises are you doing? What rep ranges are you working? Like, what are you actually doing within a given program? And then periodization is pretty much how that changes over time, or at least that's generally the types of definitions or applications that people would have here. Okay, so is it important? Somewhat. For many people, it serves more of a psychological function than a true physiological function, I think. For most of us who train, who do not have like a 4-year cycle or something like that, that we're, very clearly planning training in accordance with, we're sort of adjusting training so that we can stay interested in training. For example, if you know that this period of training is more high rep focused, we're focusing on accumulating more volume, it might be a little bit more hypertrophy focused, and then the following cycle of training is more strength focused. That gives you a sort of purpose in your training. It's like, okay, it's very clear to me what I am trying to achieve here. And if there's fluctuations and there's change and there's novelty and variation over time, then that keeps training interesting. If you did that block of let's say block of 12 reps, everything you did was 12 reps, just for example, that might be interesting if you knew you were doing it for just 4 weeks and you were like, all right, I see the purpose, I'm going to do this is what I'm going to do. But if you try and do that every month for years on end, it's going to get boring. You're going to be showing up to the gym, you're like, oh no, not 12s again, and that then affects your performance. So there's an aspect of it that is just novelty and variation based, that keeps you interested in your training, serves to motivate you, serves to keep you interested, and that to me is very valuable. I think a lot of people, when they hear people deducting from periodization or any other training theory based on psychological grounds, or suggesting that it's just, a psychological benefit, they often think that that's negative. They think that, oh, you're saying that it's useless. It's like, no, no, no. Like the psychological elements are things that we should be considering. We should be considering how motivated people are to train. We should be considering how people can stay adherent to their diets, to their training, to their lifestyle habits. So don't take that as a negative point at all. It's very much a positive thing. So they were my initial thoughts. That's the biggest thing for me. But I'll let you comment on that before we go any further.
Yeah, like I think that is hugely misunderstood in the overall discussion of periodization. People don't actually realize that it is like half the battle is psychological, and that's obviously a number that I've just picked out of nowhere, but it is somewhat true in terms of, like, I don't care if you have the most perfectly organized training plan, perfect exercise selection, perfect volume, intensity, etc. Like, if you don't want to go to the gym or you don't want to be in the gym, you're not going to progress it over time, right? So you have to take in the psychological aspect of it, the enjoyment aspect of it. Like they always say, you want to give a client a lot of what they need and then a little bit of what they want in terms of maybe exercise selection, overall training program design, etc., so that they actually want to come to the gym, they find it fun, they find it interesting, and therefore they can actually progress it long term. Like that's what you want to do with your training program, right? And so putting this into the perspective of your overall periodized training structure, like you alluded to there, like having the exact same training plan all the time, right? It can be both psychologically boring in terms of, you're like, oh, like, I just don't want to go to the gym. I don't want to have to do the exact same workout, same exercises, same rep ranges, same everything, right? There's no novelty aspect to it. And if you remember back to the episode we did on like novelty versus consistency, like again, like consistency obviously wins out, but you have to, pay respect to that novelty as well, and so again, like people are not going to be coming to the gym consistently if they're just bored by their workout, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is it's actually extremely hard to continually progress just one metric, right? And what I mean by that is if your workout is the exact same, like again, you're doing whatever, 4 or 5 different exercises, 3 sets of 12, right? If you're doing that and you're trying to progressively get stronger, because we know that's the biggest indicator of, we'll call it a muscle gain, performance increase. Obviously, if you're getting stronger, that's going to increase your performance, whatever. It's basically the most important thing going to the gym, to progressively overload the muscles, while keeping tension on the target muscles, So progressive overload, pretty important. Right? I don't know about you, but if you've ever gone to the gym for a continual length of time and you do the exact same workout, same rep range, same exercises, everything's the exact same, you not only physically may not be able to overload it, but mentally, you're like, oh, okay, I did 5s, like 3 sets of 5 on this exercise last week, or 2-3 days ago. Like, I don't think I can add more weight to this. Mentally, you're just not there. You're like, oh, I've been doing 5s for the last 3 months. I just can't add another kilo to the bar. I can't add anything to the bar. It's just mentally you're not there. Maybe physically you're like, yeah, I probably could add whatever 1.25 or 2.5 kilos. Like your body is able for it. You're still in that phase where weekly you can make progress. But the fact that mentally you're coming into that like, oh man, I'm actually mentally exhausted from just doing 5 reps all the time. Not even that you're bored of it. You're like, yeah, I'm still enthusiastic about training. It's mentally draining. And you can tie this back into like the nervous system adaptations and whatever else. But ultimately, like, it doesn't really matter to understand that or whatever. What matters is that it can be a real struggle to motivate yourself to try to then progress the weights you're using if you're kind of like, oh, like it's the exact same thing as I've always been doing. Like, I'm just not motivated to add more weight to the bar, try to push myself, like maybe you go in there and you're going, okay, I have 3 sets of 5 to do, and you get to 4 reps and you're just like, oh, like I could push myself to get that extra rep, but mentally I'm not checked in this workout, so that can be tied into both the nervous system side of things, but also then the mental side of things, because obviously those two things are somewhat linked. And you might be just like, oh, I'm too bored to go do my workout. I'm too, burnt out to want to progress my workout. Or, I'm just not motivated overall to work out or progress the weights that I'm using, So periodization comes into that then, where you might then use a protocol where you are varying the reps in a given block over time, whatever. There's multiple ways you can do this. We'll kind of go through a few different strategies in a while, but there's some variety, there's some novelty to your workout that's obviously planned. It's not just like every single workout you're like, well, this week I'm doing 5s, next week I'm doing 13s, next week I'm doing 20s, and then there's no logical order to this. You're just picking random numbers and random sets or whatever. Like if that's the case, then it's like, okay, well, there's too much novelty, there's not enough consistency, right? So again, you have to play these things off each other and understand that like progressive tension overload is the key driver, but that has to respect you actually wanting to get to the gym, you being motivated to progress the weights you're using, you actually, feeling like this workout is working for me, like the whole psychological side of things has to be respected whenever we talk about this. And periodization is one of the ways that you can actually respect that.
Yeah, and one of the things that does kind of pop up, you kind of alluded to it, is like when people constantly repeat the same thing over and over and over and over again, one of the things that can develop is start to experience, pain. They might, like, that's not always the case, but if someone begins to experience, let's say, shoulder pain in the bench press, and they've been doing the same rep range, the same similar weights for months and months and months and months on end, you don't just want to kind of keep driving on with that. So for me, it's always about kind of like, or not always, but a lot of it is, you're being preventative, with your training planning. You're saying, all right, we're gonna vary things every now and then. We're gonna make sure that you're used to performing a lot of exercises from a kind of baseline fitness characteristic perspective. So like you've got a broad base of things you're able to do, but you're also varying the way that you are applying loads to the body so that we're not developing, any sort of pain or injury that might crop up, because it does seem like that tends to happen for some people. We don't have like a lot of evidence on that. Like there's not longitudinal, like long-term research on, following people who do a particular exercise and seeing, who experiences pain, what are the rates. We don't have that evidence, but it does seem theoretical that would increase risk. Both it's something that we see in other sports, and it seems to crop up in practice anyway. For example, one of the things that can happen is someone might have shoulder pain when they bench press, but with a very slight, relatively slight technique variation, such as like a close grip bench press or something, their shoulder pain might just go away. They're like, oh yeah, that's cool. I can actually do that. And then you just basically do that for 6 weeks. And then when you get back to the bench press, you feel a bit better. You feel ready to go again. You're not experiencing that. It's not necessarily that you strength are now not experiencing that pain. So that's what you take as your indicator. Like, all right, that was probably a good decision. I think sometimes people don't take heed of those things that you observe in real life without having, it's a strong theory to support it. And that can be a bit foolish sometimes, because if you know that when you do, squats consistently for weeks and weeks and months on end, and you know that after a period of time, your knees kind of start to become the limiting factor because they end up being quite sore, and that's your main squat variation, then you don't necessarily need a particular research paper to make a decision on that. If you can make a decision that changes your variation and that feels better, then you've now got that evidence that you have essentially lived, and you can use that then as you go forward. Okay, so that's kind of theory in practice, So yeah, that's one of the big things for me, is trying to avoid the onset or basically work around or reduce the symptoms of pain that people experience. So like that's something that I do a lot of the time when people do experience pain in a particular area of their body. Like for example, knee pain. There's one guy that just started working with me recently. His knee pain is a problem for him, and it has been for quite a while. So that will be something that we play around with. We're kind of thinking, we're open to the idea of changing repetition ranges. We're open to the idea of changing exercises. So you do have to be flexible in that sense. And And there's an element of, being proactive and planning in advance when you're going to change exercise variations, when you're going to change repetition ranges that you're working in. But it doesn't necessarily need to be a particular type of periodization for that to come about. And I think that's probably the thing that people don't often grasp, is that you can make decisions on the fly. You can make decisions as you go. It doesn't have to be a particular type of periodization to be effective training planning over time. So yeah.
Yeah, and then related to the pain thing is also the muscle hypertrophy thing, right? And what I mean by that is, like what you're talking about there is effectively allocating intensity and volume according to how pain appears or how it crops up, or how to essentially work around that, right? But that's the exact same with actually trying to build muscles long term. What I mean by that is, just because you designed your perfect training program, you're like perfectly allocated enough volume to each muscle group, that doesn't mean that that's correct over time. And what I mean by that is, you might find that, your chest responds really well to 6 sets. That's all it really needs to continue progressing over time, right? But your shoulders, they just, no matter what volume you're doing, they don't seem to grow, right? So you want to be able to play around with the amount of volume you're allocating to those muscles. And what I mean by that is, you might start off a workout training program that has 10 sets twice per week for your chest, right? And you might notice that you get unbelievable results with that, but you've only allocated 6 total sets for your shoulders in your program. And you're like, okay, my shoulders are a weak point. My chest now, it's an unbelievable strong point, right? But I want to bring up my shoulders. So over time, you can periodize your training so that you get the stimulus on your chest that you need to continue progressing it, or maintain it. Maybe that's what you need. But you also get enough volume on your shoulders that you're trying to progress, So it's very similar to the way you would then go, okay, I have pain in my shoulder, or I have pain in my knee, or I have pain in my hip, or whatever. You're like, okay, let's allocate the amount of training volume we're doing to that area so that we can work around it. The same thing applies to, your body's response to resistance training. You might be like, okay, I have certain muscle groups that respond really well. Maybe I want to enhance that response. I want to do more work for that muscle group. Or you're like, okay, well, I can allocate less volume to that muscle group, and I can use that recovery capacity to allocate more volume to a lagging muscle group, right? And again, this could apply to strength as well, not just the actual muscle perspective. You might be like, look, I literally need to do 1 set of deadlifts per week, and it just seems to keep climbing, whereas my squat has stagnated and I'm doing that once per week. And maybe you need to increase the frequency at which you do that squat movement, or strengthen the muscles involved in that squat movement, whatever it is, So even though that is a little bit more of a programming thing, it does also actually apply to the periodization paradigm, right? In terms of how you're structuring your overall training program over time, just because you've magically picked a number out of your head that's 12 sets is what you've allocated for your quads. That doesn't mean that that's the perfect setup for your quads over time. You might be like, yeah, okay, over time I need less, I need more. And you have to have a program, or a program structure that allows you to allocate volume according to your overall needs, recovery capacity, and actual growth characteristics, or whatever you want to call them, So like Gary was saying, you have to somewhat be able to do that on the fly, Obviously, you want to have some sort of structure to that over time. Like you're like, okay, well, I'm going to spend 12 weeks really bringing up my chest, and then I'm going to spend 12 weeks just maintaining that and bringing up my shoulders, or whatever it is, Like obviously you can do that, have a structure to it, but at the same time, you might also not need to have as rigid a structure. You might be like, yes, the goal is still to bring up my chest, but it's actually becoming overpowering, and I'm going to just dial back volume a little bit and increase the volume from my shoulders, and have a more balanced physique, or whatever, So you have to keep that in mind. You want to be able to allocate volume and intensity, because that's obviously another part of it, according to what you're trying to achieve, and then how your body is responding over time. Like it's not just like you can set the program, you're done, see you later. That's not the case. So yes, you have to acknowledge the psychological side of things, but you also have to acknowledge that your goals are going to somewhat change over time. Like it's not like they're completely static. Your body is going to respond, and you're going to have to respond accordingly.
Yeah, and I think importantly, the things that we're touching on here, like we're basically kind of making the case for, yeah, you should vary things over time, but there's not a very clear kind of logical structure in that. Excuse me. There's not a very, very clear logical structure in that you don't have to like, it's not like this is a prerequisite to this training cycle and then you do this training cycle and then you do this training cycle. Like we don't have that level of granularity that we can say, oh, you need to do this and then you do this and then you get the adaptations, you know. The extent of the sort of periodization research out there, like that's out there, essentially would suggest like more than periodization. It's just basically says variation is probably good. Like that is generally the takeaway I would get from reading periodization research. You know, you can see that like people will say daily undulated periodization is superior to non-undulating periodization forms. But when you actually take into consideration what daily undulating periodization is, it's like, oh well, it's not really periodization in the way people typically speak about it. It's just some sort of variation between training days, you know, which is funny because it, like, people often dress that stuff up to be like, oh, these are the new scientific findings, as if it's like incredible. Whereas in reality, it's like, oh, any coach would do that. Like, surely you kind of have a bit of variation in there every now and then. So that's essentially what is so. Like basically, what I think the way that we would generally conceptualize periodization is that, you know, you're having variation in the program, both on the macro level and the micro level. Like I'm a big fan personally of sort of like micro variation. So at the micro level within the workout or within the week, like for example, day one of a program might be an upper body training day, and the bench press is being worked more so in, let's say, the 5 to 8 repetition range, whereas day two, the person does a little bit more in the 7 to 12 repetition range, whatever repetition range you're concerned with, you know. So they're the types of things that I like to see put into practice. I think there's, you know, great benefits there from a psychological kind of adherence perspective. I really like when, like personally, and clients seem to agree, I like the idea of having 2 different repetition ranges in the week, because it doesn't feel like you're working the same thing. It's almost like one day I'm thinking about my 5 rep max, like what's my 5 rep max, and then the next day I'm thinking about what's my 8 rep max, what's my 12 rep max, you know, where are we going, how far am I from that? And you can almost like dissociate it from the other workout. Whereas if you're always doing the same repetition range, for example, you do sets 5 and you do that twice per week, it's unlikely you're probably going to be lifting the same weights, and sometimes you might even have to lift less weights later in the week because maybe you're fatigued or whatever. And that can feel a bit stale. It can feel like, oh God, you know, I'm just kind of lifting the same weight. I already did this. I've achieved this. Like, I don't want to do this again. And obviously that's part of training. But if you've got variation, then it can be like, oh, this is actually quite different. And that's the same on the macro level. You know, month to month, you've got those repetition range variations. As we said, exercise variations and stuff like that. You can feel like, oh, this is different, while very much training the actual same fitness characteristics, you know. And that's kind of the crux of it, really, that I think, like, a lot of people get confused. They think that these are vastly different fitness characteristics that you end up working. Like, for example, if you do a dumbbell bench press versus a flat barbell bench press, it's like, yeah, that's different, but it's not that different, you know, in terms of your adaptations, especially when you look long term. Yeah, your adaptations aren't going to be that different, you know. Similar with repetition ranges, like, are sets of 6 that different from sets of 10? Like, yeah, they're different in terms of like long term. Yeah, you're going to build muscle, you're going to build strength, like, but it's these types of performances are so close together that we forget that, because we forget that we're only focused on resistance training, you know. And I think a lot of people, that strength conditioning coaches that discuss periodization, they have to think of it from the perspective of lots of different fitness characteristics, you know. We're thinking about agility, thinking about speed, endurance, strength, hypertrophy, things. Whereas for those of us who are more concerned with the kind of gym stuff, it's like you can be fooled into thinking that sets of 8 are vastly different from sets of 12, just because I think we over theorize sometimes within the small field of lifting weights, you know.
That's very true, right? So to make this more apparent what we're talking about, because I think that kind of covers a lot of what needs to be covered. Like, we could get into like different muscular adaptations, you know, like, let's say higher reps, you know, they're we'll call them more metabolic in nature, more muscular in nature, like you may be prioritizing those adaptations, potentially because you're accumulating more volume. They're better for hypertrophy, for a given unit of time, we'll call it, whatever you want to talk about. So they might be more beneficial for certain characteristics, and lower repetitions, we'll say they're better for a nervous system adaptation, a neurological adaptation, and obviously still muscular in nature, maybe not as much vascular adaptations or metabolic adaptations, right? So if you can kind of categorize those two things, the lower the reps, the more neurological it is, and the higher the reps, the more metabolic / muscular it is, right? And that's a kind of very vague framework you can use. However, like Gary was saying there, that the differences aren't that huge. Like, yeah, if you're doing triples, the differences between triples and 12s, they're probably big, right? But the difference between what most people do in terms of, we'll say most people are somewhere in the range of 6 to 15 reps, we'll say 5 to 15 reps even, not that different. Like, even though, yeah, there is a huge difference, you're going to get way more, well, I say way more, you're going to get more strength focus from doing the 5 reps, and you're going to get more of an endurance focus from doing the 15 reps. Like, over time, as long as both individuals are progressing the weight that's being used, like, I don't see there being this huge magnitude of difference. Like, yes, if you were to test either of those individuals, because this is how people kind of go and justify like their rep range, whatever. They're like, oh, well, I did 5s my whole life, and then I did a 1 rep max, and I was stronger than the guy that did 15s his whole life, And it's like, yeah, like obviously, again, we're talking about there are different fitness characteristics. You did 5s your whole life, closer to a single, so I would presume you're going to be better at exhibiting strength for that single, Whereas the guy who did 15s, that's quite a bit away from singles, so he's not going to be as good as, expressing that skill, that single ability, right? But the opposite could be true. I could get the person that's been doing 5s their whole life to do a set of 15, and all of a sudden they fucking shit the bed at rep 8, They're gasping for air. They can hardly, even though they're using a weight that's 20-30% lower than their 5 reps, they're gasping for air, they're dying, they're like, I can't feel my muscles, they're full of acid, like it's like you've just trained different fitness characteristics, and over time, if you had trained a variety of rep ranges, a variety of exercises, you would ultimately be better equipped to deal with whatever is coming your way. And we talked about this before in terms of being a generalist versus a specialist. 100%. If you're a powerlifter, you need to train a certain way, right? But as we were saying, like, if you're just someone that's looking to look better, feel better, be stronger, get bigger, whatever, there's not a huge difference in terms of the way you structure your training, in terms of the rep ranges you choose, because most people are going to be working in that kind of 5 to 15 rep range then, so that kind of brings me to the next point. Like, what are some different strategies for Gen Pop to think about this? Because we'll get to athletes in a second, because they have some specific considerations. And I suppose I should say before all this discussion effectively comes from athletes. Like Gary was saying, their coaches of actual athletes have much more on their mind than someone who is just coaching, even strength and conditioning for, powerlifting or whatever. It's like they have a lot more characteristics to deal with, like I was saying, endurance, agility, like there's so much more to think about. And how do you structure that? How do you prioritize things over a given year, 4-year cycle, 8-year, 20-year cycle, an individual's lifetime, So there's way more to this for an actual athletic endeavor. So we'll leave that for now, and we'll just touch on what people really want to hear, which is, how do they periodize their training for increased strength, increased muscle, increased fitness, if they are someone who is, Gen Pop. So what are some strategies, Gary?
Yeah, so as you alluded to, when you're dealing with some sort of athlete, someone who competes in sport, just to put it aside, I tend to be a lot more thoughtful and deliberate with how exactly the next few months are going to go. For a general population person, and that includes me, it includes you, it's a bit, it's not less thoughtful, but there's more potential training options, training like big picture structures that we could use and still move in the right direction. Whereas when someone is competing in a particular sport and they have a deadline, there's less fitness characteristics. The rest of us, it's like, all right, what are you actually trying to achieve? Most people are trying to build a bit of muscle, get a bit stronger. It's like, all right, that's very reasonable goals, but do you need to, really, really focus on having one particular structure? No. So as you alluded to, there's many options. So some of the things that, like, to start off, I think it's useful to elaborate on what I actually do myself in practice with my clients, because that obviously is useful. So kind of vary from phase to phase without being like I'm not necessarily saying in 2 years time or in a year's time even we're going to be doing this repetition range, but rather it's like we have sort of outcome based goals that we're looking towards in the future, and we adjust the process as we kind of get there. For example, let's say someone sets the goal of hitting a set of 5 at 180 kilos on the deadlift. We'll try and move programming toward that point. Let's say it's 6 months away. We try and move programming toward that point, so that we can get there, and then we'll adjust our goals. So training will move then in accordance with that. So if that happens in 6 months, then I'm thinking about what we're going to do for the next 6 months. So that might be, we work in the 5 to 7 repetition range, more so for 1 month or for 6 weeks or whatever the duration of the training program is. And then we spend a bit more time, we actually do some more 8 to 12s, and then we come back down again and we get more specific. So basically what I'm saying is that you can have quite a lot of flexibility within this if you know where you're going. And I think that's the important thing, is to have an idea of where you're going. So if you know that, for example, a 5 rep max is the goal you set, then you want to have 5s in there, maybe every training cycle, but at least every second training cycle. You want to have them in there so that you can actually practice them. If you're not practicing what you're trying to achieve, how you're going to measure your goal, then you're not equipped to perform the test, so you mightn't actually get there as quick as you otherwise would. So yeah, you can do kind of like month to month cycle kind of up, down, up, down, up, down, like you're basically kind of fluctuating just the repetition range you're using. Or you could use, and I do this as well, where you're kind of using more like linear stepwise approach. Like for example, you could using like 5 to 7 reps, then you could be using 8 to 12 reps, and then you could be using 12 to 15 reps, and you might do that over a period of 3 blocks of 4 weeks, 3 blocks of 6 weeks. And like that's an option that I think a lot of people tend to enjoy. In my experience, people tend to enjoy the other way around a bit more, because you start with your 12 to 15s, and it's kind of nice to see it flow forward, because you start with lighter weights and you get to much heavier weights, and it almost like it exaggerates the strength that you've built in a way, which can make training really enjoyable, because you're gradually getting more and more specific to the test that you're considered with, or that you're concerned with, which is going to be, the lower repetition strength expression, if that's your goal. So you're getting gradually towards that test. You're starting to learn more and more about training specific to higher intensities, and you can end up lifting a lot of weight, and your true strength gain and kind of pseudo strength gain in the form of getting better at the test are both expressed, and that makes training really enjoyable because you got more weight in the bar. So I like that. But I also, as I said, I'm happy to kind of like pivot up and down and up and down and up and down with repetition ranges, or even with volume. Because I suppose like I'm focusing very much here on repetition ranges, but the same thing applies to your overall volume, like the total number of sets that you do. From that perspective, I'm a fan of keeping it fairly evenly spread and not adjusting volume that much for a lot of people. But when we've got people who have particular muscle groups they want to develop, that's when I'm being far more thoughtful and far more deliberate about how we're actually adjusting our volume. It might be the case that if someone's trying to bring up their chest, we have a higher volume chest phase, but at the end, their shoulders get a little bit niggly, they don't feel 100%. So we back off a bit before we push on again. So they're kind of on the ground decisions that you make, but those that kind of linear and reverse linear structure while having some undulation in there can be nice. And when I say undulation, instead of doing, say, 12s or 12 to, or just 12s, you could do 8s, 10s, and 12s on 3 different days, for example. And that's just some form of undulation that's in there. And as I alluded to at the start, variation within programming is tends to be pretty effective, and it definitely keeps things enjoyable. So if you've got that variation on the kind of more macro level, like multi-month, and then you've got variation on the more micro level, like workout to workout, I think you're doing a pretty good job. And once you know where you want to go, it's easy to make those sort of decisions as you go through the process.
Yeah, I would be very similar in terms of there's usually kind of two programs that if someone's coming to me, they're kind of a Gen Pop person, you know, they're just looking to get fitter, get stronger, look better, whatever. There's kind of two program structures, I should say, two periodization structures, you know, that I use. The first one would be what we'll call it a ramp up approach. And what this would be like a kind of a fixed program, right? Like you were saying earlier on, you might be like, these are the characteristics that I really want to train for. These are my exact goals. And what I might do with that individual is be like, right, so we're going to lay out the next 8 to 10 weeks of training, right? It's going to be roughly the same program. Like we might tweak it as we go. We might have, you know, in a given workout, we might have lower reps and higher reps, or across the week, like you were saying, we might have one day that is slightly lower in reps and one day that is slightly higher in reps. Again, it depends on the goals. It depends on what exactly we're trying to do. But the program is somewhat fixed for a given length of time. But what we'll do is the first, we'll say 1 to 3 weeks, there's somewhat of a ramp up. And what I mean by that is you might start that workout or start that training block with a very lowered RPE. You know, you might even start as low as like 5 or 6 in terms of like you have quite a lot of reps in reserve for all of your exercises. And you're effectively using the first 1 to 3 weeks to really nail the movements down, really get comfortable expressing your strength in those given rep ranges, etc., whatever, again, exactly we're trying to accomplish. And then over that 8 to 12 week training block, we're really looking to push forward with, you know, attacking specific rep range, rep targets, strength targets, etc., over that time, right? So again, the first 1 to 3 weeks, again, depending on what exactly we're trying to achieve, how long we have, etc. So the program stays somewhat fixed. You know, you've got 1 to 3 weeks of a ramp up in terms of lower intensity, and then you're really trying to push forward with trying to hit heavier and heavier weights as the program continues on for that 10 to 12 weeks, whatever it is, right? Now, that's one way I do it. And again, within that, like you were saying, that might have different rep ranges on a given day. That might have different rep ranges for given exercises and in a workout to workout fashion. So you might start each training day with something that's really heavy, like say, for example, something for like a set of squats, 3 sets of squats for 5 reps, for example. And then as the workout progresses, you might do, you know, we'll say 3 sets of 8 on a hack squat, and you might do 3 sets of 12 on a quad extension, for example, right? So that given workout, quad focused, you're really working on a variety of rep ranges, a variety of exercises, you know, and then the rest of that workout, maybe you touch on hamstrings a little bit and obviously those juicy calves, right? For example, just with that, right? However, it could also be that you have one day you really focus on strength, you're doing a lower body workout, we'll say, and all of the rep ranges are in that kind of lower rep range, either we'll say 6 to 8, well, we'll say 6, well, we'll actually just say 3 to 6, somewhere in that rep range, you know? And then the workouts later in the week, you're somewhere in the rep ranges between whatever, 6 to 12. Maybe you're doing 8s, maybe you're doing 12s, maybe you're even doing 15s, whatever it is, right? So that can be really effective for individuals because that keeps the interest, it keeps things progressing, it gives them some sort of ramp up so that it's not just, here's your new program, go balls to the wall from the start, and you can effectively only progressively overload this for 4 weeks because you started at RPE 9, you know? So that's what I like with this one. You can kind of go, okay, we're going to ramp it up slowly, keep a few reps in reserve, and then slowly over time add weight. And maybe we strategically change volume around based on how the body's progressing, based on, like you said, any little niggles that are occurring, whatever, right? So that's really nice. It does need to have a definitive endpoint, however, because what people will try to do is just continue running that and then effectively burn themselves out, and that's not exactly what we want. What I would do then at the end of that is assess how we got on. Again, depends on how and what time frame, or rather, it depends on what exactly we're trying to achieve and what time frame we have. But again, we look at that at the end of that and go, okay, this is what we achieved. We didn't achieve these goals that we set out for, but we achieved these goals. So now we know that, okay, we need to put a little bit more priority on this. Like, we'll basically assess, why did things go right and why did things go wrong? And then you can effectively use the exact same template of like a few weeks ramping up and, continue on for whatever, 6 to 12 weeks, whatever it is, And that's really effective for individuals that, kind of know how to train, really kind of push themselves, and they don't mind doing the same workout week to week to week to week for a given length of time with less variety, because they know that it's like, okay, we're doing this for 8 weeks, and I know the first 3 weeks I'm ramping up, and then the intensity keeps ramping up. But I know by the end of week 8, we're done with this, and then we're going to be changing the workouts around, right? So it still respects the psychology. Obviously, it depends on the individual. Still respects the focus on progressive overload, and then still respects, trying to get a variety of rep ranges in your training program. So that's one way. Obviously, there's a lot of variability in that. I'm not exactly giving you a precise program. I'm just giving you some sort of framework to think about it. And then the other type of periodization that I like for a lot of people is, like Gary was saying, that kind of stepwise periodization. Like, I like to call it like accumulation intensification. So we'll do 4 weeks of a higher rep range training block, and then we'll do 4 weeks of a lower rep range training block. And I kind of like to cycle between 4 weeks of 10 to 12 reps, and then 4 weeks of 6 to 8 reps, And again, that's for the majority of people, that seems to work well, because they know, okay, so I know for 4 weeks I'm doing higher reps, but I know after that I'm going to be doing lower reps. And like Gary said, this can be really nice, because effectively over those few weeks, you start the first week, you use whatever weights you're using, and by the end of that first 4 weeks, you've increased your strength in the 10 to 12 rep range. Maybe you're only getting 10 reps. You started out with 3 sets of 12, and as you've progressed over those whatever 4 weeks, you're now only getting 3 sets of 10, right? And then the next week you come in, you only have to do 3 sets of 8. So it gives a nice little like continuous stepwise jump in terms of your ability to add weight. Because then again, by the end of that next 4 week block of that 6 to 8 reps, you might have started at 3 sets of 8, and then you're finished at 3 sets of 6, right? But it's still giving you enough variety in terms of what you're trying to achieve, while also respecting the main goal of progressively overloading, weights, so that's a framework that I really like. I think that's one of the easiest ways for individuals to program their training. Set a training program for 8 weeks, do 4 weeks of it at higher reps and 4 weeks at it at lower reps. And you obviously don't want to do like hugely divergent rep ranges. Like, you don't want to be like, yes, I'm choosing 12 to 15 reps for my first 4 weeks, and then I'm doing 1 to 3 reps for my second block of 4 weeks. That doesn't really make sense in terms of giving you a clear structure to overload it. And like we were saying earlier on, those fitness characteristics are way more divergent than the difference between 6 reps and 12 reps. So you have to keep that in mind. But that is something that I really like for a lot of people, just having 4 week blocks of higher reps, 4 week blocks of lower reps, still staying within that framework of like kind of 6 to 12 reps. So they're 2 strategies that I really like. Obviously we're not going to go into every single possible permutation of how you can set up and how you can periodize your training, but that should give you some idea if you are someone who is, gen pop, looking to look better, get stronger, get fitter, etc. So you have anything else to add for that, for the gen pop people, Gary?
The only thing I would say is that, don't get too caught up in your top-down planning either. I think we actually had a full podcast on this before, but basically just to reinforce it, if you have a plan, you can still change that plan, and that's really important to be aware of, because some people, for example, if they take that structure and they go 8 to 12, 6 to 8, 4 to 6 over the course of 12 weeks, like, don't keep pushing on if it gets to the point where as you go into the period of your 4 to 6 reps, your knees are already, really fatigued. You feel like you've accumulated a lot of knee pain from the previous phase, like for whatever reason, you could have a recurring patellar tendinopathy, whatever it might be, or shoulder pain, anything else. Like, feel free to make decisions to change, to be like, actually, you know what, I might go back to 12 to 15 and see how that feels. I don't feel like heavy loading is the best thing for the moment. You have to always have that flexibility to make those decisions, and to recognize that that's not necessarily detrimental to your long-term progress, because I think some people can get a bit confused and they think that we have to have this structure to training for you to progress, and that's just not the case at all. So that's the only thing I would reinforce for us, for the Gen Pop folks, and it also applies to people who take their training more seriously.
Yeah, and obviously you have to factor in that it is a razor's edge in terms of, like, you don't want to be like, oh yeah, like I was feeling a little bit of a niggle here, so I just scrapped the entire training program. Or, oh, like, I know I started this training program and I had X, Y, and Z exercises, but I'm kind of bored of them, so I just swapped them out and I just continued with my training block then. Like, so you don't want to be just making huge, drastic changes to your training program on somewhat of a whim, but you also don't want to be just so rigidly adherent to your training program that your body is falling apart and you're like, oh, but I have to finish the program. Like, people will do this a lot when they're presented with a given program. People are like, this will increase your squat by fucking 200 pounds or whatever. They're like say small of, they're like, you have to do this, and they're like, okay, yeah, I'll do that. And they're on their 5th set of their 7 sets of squats for that given day, and they're like, I actually feel like my spine is about to blow out onto the wall behind me just after my knees blow out into the wall in front of me. So it's like, don't be so rigidly structured in your program that your body is telling you to go fuck yourself and you don't listen to it. But again, don't be so unrigid in your adherence to the training program that oh, well, last week, squats were a little bit challenging, so I swapped them out this week. Like, you don't want to be on that side of things either. So I think that helps the Gen Pop people. Now, Gary, how do we help the athletes?
Good old athletes. Athletic considerations are obviously a little bit more specific, and the main consideration here is like what the sport is. Like, that's obviously a big consideration, but also what the seasons are like. After working with more GA athletes through our online coaching, like, there's a lot of variation in how different players kind of treat their seasons depending on who they play with. I've got one client,
and what level they're at, because
yeah,
like, basically is like, oh, if you're good, we're going to work you until we can't work you anymore, and then you're going to start the next season again.
Yeah, like some county players are playing county, so they could be playing for Kerry, but they could also be playing for like East Kerry, and they also play for Spas, like their club. They're playing with multiple different teams, but not only that, their seasons are actually varying within that. So it's not just the case that I'm actually kind of second guessing myself. Do you play with East Kerry and Spa, or do you just play with East Kerry? I'll need to confirm that one.
Kerry's a shithole. Who cares?
Anyway, pretty sure you do, but anyway, let's forget that for the moment. Just kind of second guessing myself. So if you're playing for multiple teams, then one of the things that you're going to experience is that you've got varying points of emphasis in terms of the season. For example, like, this applies to any sport, but let's say you've got one competition for one club. Like, it could be college as well. Like, you're concerned with the college football team, but also your football club. You could have one competition in September, and then you have the other competition in March. And if you've got that sort of like polarity to it, where like they're totally like pretty much opposite ends of the year, they're like pretty far from each other, then you never really have a time to it's not necessarily rest, but you never have time to back away and do much less training. Because if you're constantly thinking of training, All right, I'm going to focus a little bit on hypertrophy for a while. I'm going to focus on bringing up my conditioning. Like they're my goal at the moment. And maybe I'll do a little bit less sport specific stuff in the meantime. If you're constantly doing the same thing, it can be easy to get a little bit burnt out. So that's a barrier. And that's something that you have to build into your sort of quote unquote periodization structure. So let's say we did have that where September and March were the most important periods of time for you. Then in that case, what you'd be looking at is taking that month or two after competition to focus a little bit more on your generalized fitness characteristics that may not be as specific to your sport. And then you get increasingly specific as you get towards competition time. And that can be difficult for some people because they might be, they're constantly playing throughout the season during that. And sometimes there's a case of just understanding that you can't be peaked all of the time. And that's why you have to choose what is actually important to you. And, for example, one of my clients, Lucia, she competed at a powerlifting meet recently, but she also did one in August. So when she initially signed up for coaching, one of the decisions that we made was that, right, your competition in October is far more important than your competition, or November, started in November, far more important than your competition in August. So as a result, we didn't peak for that first meet. We didn't have a more specific, intensified approach. We were still doing a lot more volume. We were still doing we had a lot more variation within the program. And we decided that, if we had to take suboptimal performance at that meet, that was okay because we were really aiming for the one in November. So then as November approached, that's when we got more specific with things and focused more on, working in the 1 to 3 repetition range, focusing primarily on the exercises that were going to be executed in competition, i.e. squat, bench, deadlift. So they're the types of things that I think about in practice. It's about asking, what is the biggest priority? Like if you've got multiple different competitions, you kind of have to ask yourself, like, what's the one that matters most to you? And sometimes that can be hard because if you're in a knockout competition, for example, then it's like, you kind of have to be on your game all the time because you can't just be like, oh, I'll play well in the final, because you actually have to get there. So that's obviously quite hard. And that is one of the challenges with some sports where you don't have the luxury of being able to intensify as you go along, and you kind of just have to keep things ticking over. But in general, my big picture framework would be focusing more on generalized fitness characteristics and laying that foundation when you can in the off season, and not focusing solely on the specifics of the sport. And that can be hard because, for example, if you finish a competition season and you've identified all of the weak points in very specific things, then it can be sometimes hard to take a step back and say, all right, what are the big picture generalized fitness characteristics that I might want to work on? Because now is my chance, especially when you're just out of competition. So there'd be some of my initial thoughts.
Yeah, like what I always think with explaining periodization to athletes, there's essentially 3 things that you always have to keep in mind. First of all, you can't be peaked all the time, right? So you have to pick the time you want to perform at your best. And I don't mean like the exact 3:15 on Sunday the 16th, but like that might actually be the case that you need to do that. But you want to be, at your best or around your best at a given time period. It could be during the season. You want to be at your best towards the end of the season, or you want to be at your best for a given competition on a specific date, whatever it is. There's a certain time that you're like, this is when I want to prioritize being at my best, right? We can call that being peaked, right? So that's the first thing. You need to prioritize when you want to be peaked, and you have to always keep in mind that you can't be peaked all the time. Anyone that tries to sell you the magical training program that has you peaked all the time is lying to your face, right? So, and again, this is because people say like, fatigue masks fitness. The stuff that you need to do to get to where you want to be may actually make you worse in the short term, right? And this is the second point, right? Is that if you're prioritizing something, you may actually notice decrements in other areas, right? And this is especially true when you're trying to do something like, say, gain muscle or strength. You might be in the gym, you're training yourself fucking hard as fuck. You're pushing yourself, you're getting stronger, you're building muscle, you're doing whatever. You maybe have a little bit of delayed onset muscle soreness, you have a bit of, generalized fatigue. And that might mean that your sport suffers as a result. Like you might not be as fast as you normally are. Your legs are a little bit more fatigued, they're a little bit tired. They're not able to exhibit as much force as you would like, right? So in the short term, because you're prioritizing, muscle gain, strength, whatever other characteristic you're prioritizing, your performance in other areas may go down. That doesn't mean, and it shouldn't be thought of as, oh, my resistance training is making me a shitter runner, or whatever. It's like, yeah, that's true in the short term, but once we drop back the volume, once we stop pushing really heavy weights or whatever it is, you're going to be able to be stronger and actually improve the other fitness characteristic that was being neglected at that time, or being kept on maintenance, right? Which brings me to the final thing that I always remind athletes is it's far easier to maintain a characteristic than it is to build a characteristic, right? And what I mean by that is if you're trying to get stronger, you have to put in a high degree of effort, right? A high training volume, whatever, right? But to maintain the strength you've built, you can get away with so little. Like, it's actually surprising how little you can do and still keep the strength that you've built, right? So if you can keep those three things in mind, you can't be peaked all the time, and you should pick the events you want to be peaked for. You are likely going to find that, training to gain a fitness characteristic may decrease your performance in other areas. Like you can't be, again, that's kind of, you can't be peaked at all the time or at all times. And then again, like maintaining a characteristic is far easier than, gaining a characteristic. Once you understand that, you can kind of go, okay, now I understand why I should periodize my training, and I also understand that, yes, short-term decrements may occur, but they're going to pay off in the long term, And so the actual way you implement that for an athlete, like obviously this is going to be hugely dependent on the sport, the season, the whatever, like you were saying there with like essentially field sport athletes like GA or whatever, like that's one aspect to it. But you could also go down to like we'll call it the fighting stuff. They essentially just are always trying to be peaked. They're always trying to be at their fittest. They're always like, oh yeah, I'll take a fight on 2 weeks notice, and yeah, there might be better or more important competitions or whatever, but a lot of people don't periodize their training towards that. Obviously the top fighters do. Well, maybe not in the UFC as much, but like say in boxing or whatever, the top fighters do. They're like, oh well, I'm going to have a 12-16 week camp that gets me ready for a fight, unless of course they're taking a fight on short notice, someone broke their hand, wrist, whatever the fuck, something happened. But most of them will be like, yeah, I have a 12 or 16 week camp to get me ready for that. That's periodization. That is effectively what they're doing. They're periodizing their training. That it's like, okay, well, I have this multi-million-dollar fight and I'm going to periodize my training so that the 12 weeks run up to that fight, I'm going to be peaked. I'm going to be at my absolute best for that fight, right? That's periodization, right? But a lot of sports don't have the luxury of having a single event. A lot of them are a season long or multi-event sports, in terms of you might be competing a few weekends in a row, or even a few events over a number of days, so you have to factor in that the fatigue might accumulate over those few days as well, so basically you're just trying to be peaked at the right time. That's the whole point of periodization for sporting athletes.
Yep. So specificity in time and in what you're actually doing. That's essentially the crux of it. That's what you need to be thinking about. You need to be asking yourself, what do I need to develop? Like, what do I really require for this particular competition or this period of time? And then you think about, all right, then I'm going to be specific with my training and put it at the right times. For example, you're not going to, like, when we talked about the general population stuff, we were saying, oh yeah, you've got lots of different variations. You can basically bulk volume. You could reduce volume as you go along, like in terms of length ranges. You could go from 12 to 15 down to 4 to 6, or 4 to 6 up to 12 to 15. It's not going to make a massive difference to your results. But if you're talking about like actual sports, like if you're talking about powerlifting, for example, I don't think anyone could make the case that doing 1 to 3 reps 4 months out and doing 12 to 15 reps for the last month before is going to be a good idea. Like, yeah, you might still get stronger, but you're not going to be peaked for what you're actually required to do. And I think for that reason, powerlifting is actually a really illustrative example of like what kind of training planning is about, because it's very clear what you're trying to achieve. It's like, this is a 1 rep max test. Very few sports are that specific, but if you can think of it in a similar manner, you can start to break them down. You can start to break things down and say, right, I play rugby. Agility is actually going to be more and more important as we get to competition time, but I might need to work in it all year round. Like, it might need to become a massive part of my training. Same with like top end speed. That might be something that you work on after you've first brought up your kind of aerobic base. If you've got a really poor conditioning and that's the limiting factor, then you'd work more so on your kind of top end speed once you've laid that base first. And that's not to say you can't do both at the same time. Like, you can, but you would want to emphasize that first. It would make sense. The same when it comes to like your actual strength. Instead of going straight to 1 to 3 rep training, you might say to yourself, actually, I've actually never dedicated time to hypertrophy. So I've never dedicated time to actually adding muscle mass to my frame. And adding muscle mass is very likely to contribute to additional strength. So that's probably an easy return on investment for me, instead of just trying to eke out every last percentage at my current body weight. Again, that's a sports specific consideration. If you are, if you're an athlete who like need to make a particular weight class, then adding more muscle mightn't be what you want to do. You might want to eke out every last percent. And your goal could really be that, like, I don't want to add any muscle. I just want to get stronger. So how can I get stronger without adding muscle? Very different to something like rugby or American football, where you're like, no, actually, if I have more muscle mass in my frame, it's likely to be pretty good for me, So again, it's sport specific when you start to break this down. But if you use that sort of like logical thought process of like, what am I trying to develop? When does it need to be maximally developed for? And then start to break things down from there and try to be specific. I think it becomes easier to plan your training.
Yeah, well, I actually have nothing else really to add, because I think then after this, the next question is just specifics for the given sport, you know? Whereas if they can just keep the framework in mind that they're just trying to be peaked at the right time, and they have to then prioritize their overall training to, actually prioritize the things they need to prioritize at the certain time point in their season, their whatever, then it just comes down to specifics. Like you said, like, you might be like, okay, well, I have no aerobic base. It's the end of the season, and I just want to do a few weeks of, we'll say, lighter training. I don't want to be fucking lashing around heavy loads or whatever. And I just want to do like 3-4 weeks of just aerobic conditioning with a maintenance strength program in the background that's just kind of keeping me ticking along. Or again, they might be like, you know what, I've actually lost 10 kilos over that season. I need to gain that back. And ideally, I want to gain that in muscle, So they might be like, right, we have 12 weeks until the next season starts. So I'm going to prioritize hypertrophy, and I'm going to keep my fitness characteristics ticking along in the background, maintaining them where they are, and, hopefully progressing them as we get into the season or whatever, So it has to make sense for your sport. It has to make sense for what you have going on, where you're deficient, where you can do it work, where you're strong. Like, it's really an athlete dependent, sport dependent, and overall training status dependent. Like, obviously, if you're the first year into your training in the sport versus your 20th year into the training in the sport, like, there are different considerations for those two athletes. Like, one of them might have to do a way more, we'll say, resilience training. They're new to the sport. They don't have the adaptations that in certain joints that keep them resilient in that sport. Like, they might be like, I don't know, a baseball player throwing balls or something. They're like, okay, well, my rotator cuff, all those muscles in the shoulder aren't strong enough. I need to really work on kind of prehab for those. And you might be working way more on that at the start of your career versus later in your career. You might be like, well, I have all those adaptations. I know exactly what exercises I need to do. I've got a well-balanced strength in my shoulders, whatever. Obviously, there are different considerations then, So you have to obviously factor that in. Anyway, Gary, I think that is everything. Do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's pretty good. I think that gives people a fairly clear idea on a kind of a meta level of like what you need to be thinking about when it comes to longer term training planning, I guess. This doesn't tell you how many reps you should do. It's not a very clear, like, I'm not going to say we're not being very clear. I'm going to say that there just isn't any clear perfect recipe here. I know people generally look for that. They think that the purpose of resistance or exercise science is just to give us the perfect recipes, but it's really not the case. We're very unlikely to have particular recipes that are just going to suit everyone, and that's why you do have to be kind of thinking on your feet, and that's why consuming information like this that gets you to think and to apply concepts instead of real specifics, I think it can be helpful. So yeah, use the info, let us know, and if you have any questions, of course, ask.
So where can people find us, Gary, and how do they engage with our services?
People can, of course, find us in our free Facebook community, the Triage Method community on Facebook. That is our Facebook group in which we have, different discussions about topics that people are interested in. For example, people will ask questions, which then influences the podcast, and it also influences the types of things that we share in the group. For example, everyone was asking questions about the Game Changers documentary that came out recently. So, I shared some resources in there that people might find helpful, because we get an idea of like, all right, what are people consuming? What are they interested in? What questions do they have? And then we can have discussions accordingly. Additionally, we share a lot of research papers and stuff like that in there. So that's a nice place to keep up with everything that we're doing. Of course, you should be subscribed to the Triage Method newsletter. That goes out every Sunday, and it's in the description box below as well, I believe. So you should subscribe to that and get our weekly newsletter with additional resources and stuff like that we've come across throughout the week that you might find helpful. Of course, you can follow us at Triage Method on various social media platforms. We've got Facebook, we've got Instagram, we've got Twitter, and we've also got a YouTube channel, and that is also titled Triage Method. So you can keep up with us on all of platforms. And in terms of actual services, then of course, that we have one-to-one online coaching. That's our most intensive service for people who have specific goals. If you want to reach your goals with a specific plan, specific guidance, specific education, then the one-to-one online coaching is the way to go. If you want a more hands-off approach, group coaching is a great option. Male and female options there as well. So that's something that you might be interested in. It's €35 a month, so it's much cheaper and it's much more hands off, but you still have a plan of action. You still have guidelines on how to modify your program. You've got an exercise library. You've got access to us to help you make nutrition decisions using our guidebooks and using the advice that we actually give. So that can be quite helpful too. So yeah, they're the main things. Of course, we've got ebooks, program templates in the shop on our website. And of course, keep up with the content on the website too. But the best way to do that is subscribe to the newsletter or join the Triage Method community on Facebook.
That was wonderful, Gary. You're so very succinct. I'm never succinct like that.
I'm a good salesman,
How are you? Yeah.
Greasy marketer.
We'll see if people actually sign up to anything after this. If you sign up because of this, just let me know. Just be like, oh, I signed up because Gary is a good salesman. Just put that in,
Gary's voice, yeah.
Wherever it says like extra notes or whatever, just be like,
therapeutic.
Gary sold me on this. That I'd really like that, just to really see how effective Gary is as a salesman.
Yeah, I need that.
Right. I have nothing else to add. Do you?
Nope. Nix, nada, niente. Nothing.
All right. Well,
too easy.
Goodbye, guys. We'll talk to you again.
Goodbye.